For 20 years. I let my own blood treat me like dirt. I sat silently by the kitchen door. I let my aunt call me a low-level secretary. A charity case. A total failure. I smiled. I kept the peace. I even paid her massive mortgage in absolute secret. But she pushed too far. At a high society dinner. In front of a billionaire. She tried to humiliate me one last time. She did not know I was a captain in the United States Navy. She did not know I dismantled live bombs with my bare hands. And she certainly did not know her own son, a Navy SEAL, was about to stand up and destroy her entire world. This is a story about the absolute power of walking away. It is a vital lesson about learning that your dignity and your self-worth are never negotiable. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever had to fight simply to be seen, hit the like button right now. Leave a comment below with your story. Subscribe to our channel. And share this video with a woman who desperately needs to remember her own strength. I am Eleanor Vance. I have spent 20 years of my life mastering the art of being invisible. It is a specific kind of skill. You learn to soften your footsteps. You learn to lower your voice. You learn to sit in a room and take up absolutely no space at all. I learned this survival tactic early. I perfected it in the home of my aunt, Margaret. Margaret is a woman who treats human beings like decorative furniture. If you do not match the aesthetic of her life, you are shoved into a corner, or you are hidden entirely. For 2 decades, I let her hide me. I let her tell her friends, her neighbors, and our extended family that I was just a quiet, unambitious clerk, a government secretary, a woman who filed paperwork in a windowless room. I let her say these things. I smiled. I nodded. I passed the butter at holiday dinners. I did not correct her. I did not defend myself. There was a reason for my silence. The lie was a shield. The truth was far too heavy for a dining room table in suburban Connecticut. I was not a secretary. I was a captain in the United States Navy. I was an explosive ordnance disposal expert. I spent my deployments walking toward the things that made other people run. I lived in a world of sand, sweat, and split-second decisions. I wore 80 pounds of Kevlar. I dismantled rigged artillery shells in the blistering heat. I held the lives of entire platoons in my shaking, gloved hands. I knew the intimate, terrifying anatomy of a bomb. I knew how to cut a wire without stopping my own heart. You do not bring that kind of darkness into Margaret S. house. You do not serve that truth with the roast beef. So I kept it in the dark. I let her have the lie. The lie was easy. The lie kept the peace. There was another reason I stayed quiet: guilt. When my mother died, I was just a teenager. Margaret took me in. She gave me a bed. She put food on the table. She never let me forget it. Every meal came with a side of obligation. Every roof shingle over my head was a debt. I internalized that debt. I carried it into adulthood. When I commissioned into the Navy, I started paying her back. Margaret lived wildly beyond her means. She wanted to be high society. She joined the country club. She bought the expensive cars. But the money was never enough. When she fell behind on her property taxes, I paid them. I set up a blind trust. I routed a significant portion of my hazard pay directly into it. The trust covered her shortfalls. It kept the sprawling Connecticut estate out of foreclosure. It kept her pristine image intact. She never knew the money came from me. She thought it was a generous dividend from my late grandfather's forgotten investments. I let her believe that too. I funded the very arrogance she used to crush me. I enabled her. I was the silent architect of her superiority complex. Then came the engagement. Margaret's daughter, Claire, was getting married, and she was not just marrying anyone. She was marrying the son of Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling was a billionaire. He was a defense contractor. He was a former military man with a reputation for being ruthless, observant, and deeply traditional. Margaret lost her mind. The wedding became a military campaign. The engagement dinner was the opening battle. She needed everything to be perfect. She needed to present a flawless, elite family to the Sterlings, and in Margaret's eyes, a middle-aged, single, government secretary was a glaring flaw. I became a problem to be managed, a stain to be covered up. Her comments grew sharper. Her disdain grew louder. She started referring to me as her charity case. She did it casually. She did it to my face. But Margaret made a critical miscalculation. She did not know that the debt was paid. A week before the engagement dinner, I sat at my kitchen table. I opened a thick, manila envelope. It was the final accounting from the blind trust. I tallied the numbers. I counted every mortgage payment, every property tax check, every country club due. I had paid back the cost of my childhood room 100 times over. The ledger was balanced. The emotional debt was gone. I picked up the phone. I called my financial manager. I gave a single, quiet order. I closed the trust. I cut the cord. I stopped the flow of invisible money. The impact was immediate. It was brutal. Margaret's reality fractured within days. Her credit cards began to bounce. The caterer for the engagement dinner demanded a massive cash deposit. The country club sent a notice of suspension. Margaret was drowning, and she had no idea why the water was suddenly so deep. She panicked. She scrambled. And like a cornered animal, she brought all of that frantic, toxic, terrifying energy straight into the engagement dinner. I knew it was coming. I could feel the pressure shifting in the room. I have spent my life reading the signs of an impending detonation. I know what a wire looks like right before it snaps. I knew Margaret was going to explode. And I knew, for the first time in 20 years, I was not going to defuse it. I was going to sit back and watch it burn. The engagement dinner was an exercise in suffocating pretense. Margaret had set the table with her grandmother's imported crystal. The silver was polished to a blinding shine. The floral centerpieces were excessively tall. They blocked the sight lines across the table. It felt less like a celebration and more like a trench war. I was assigned my usual seat. I was placed at the very end of the table. I was closest to the kitchen swinging door. It was the seat reserved for the help. It was the seat reserved for the embarrassment. I sat down. I smoothed my simple navy dress. I kept my posture perfect. I watched the room. The Sterling family arrived with quiet authority. Richard Sterling did not swagger. He walked with the heavy, grounded steps of a man who owned the ground beneath him. He had sharp, assessing eyes. He took in the crystal. He took in the flowers. He took in Margaret Wismanic, overly bright smile. He did not look impressed. He looked analytical. Margaret's son, Lucas, was also there. Lucas had recently returned from a classified overseas deployment. He was a Navy SEAL. He was the golden child. Margaret paraded him around the room like a trophy. She clung to his arm. She boasted about his bravery, even though she knew nothing of what he actually did. Lucas looked uncomfortable. He looked exhausted. He had the hollow, distant stare of a man who had left a piece of his soul in a desert. I recognized that stare. We shared a silent, fleeting glance. We did not speak. The dinner commenced. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Margaret's anxiety was vibrating off her skin. She drank her wine too fast. She laughed too loud. She was desperate to control the narrative. She wanted to prove to Richard Sterling that her family was worthy of his wealth. When the conversation lagged, she reached for her favorite weapon. She reached for me. It was a predictable tactic. Elevate yourself by stepping on someone smaller. Margaret leaned forward. She rested her manicured hand on the table. She smiled a vicious, sugary smile. "Richard, you must forgive our quiet little corner," Margaret said. Her voice rang out, silencing the low chatter. She gestured toward me. "This is my niece, Eleanor. She is our reliable little worker bee. 20 years pushing paper for the government, a secretary. It is honest work, of course, even if she lacks the drive to ever make something real of herself. But we always make room for her. Family takes care of family, no matter how small their lives are." She waited. She expected the flinch. She expected me to lower my eyes. She expected me to study my plate and absorb the humiliation. I did not. I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. The silence in the dining room stretched. It became heavy. It became dangerous. I reached into my clutch. My fingers found the cold, heavy metal of my unit challenge coin. I pulled it out. I set it down on the polished mahogany table. The metal hit the wood with a sharp, undeniable crack. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. "I am not a secretary." "Margaret," I said. My voice was low. It was perfectly level. It was the voice I used on a radio when calling in a medevac, and my life is not small. It is just heavily classified. Margaret froze. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Richard Sterling stopped chewing. His eyes locked onto the coin resting by my plate. But it was Lucas who reacted first. Lucas leaned forward. He stared at the brass coin. He saw the insignia of the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Group. He saw the master badge. The blood drained completely from his face. The golden boy of the family looked like he had been struck by lightning. Lucas stood up. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back. It scraped violently against the floor. The sound made Claire jump. "Lucas, sit down." Margaret hissed, her facade finally cracking. "Eleanor is just having one of her episodes. She is embarrassing us." "Mom," Lucas said. His voice was a low, terrifying growl. It was a voice he had never used in this house. "Stop talking. Just shut your mouth." Margaret gasped. She clutched her napkin. Lucas ignored her. He was staring at me. His eyes were wide. They were filling with tears. "3 years ago," Lucas said, his voice shaking but loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Syria, a rigged compound. My team was pinned down. We were surrounded by tripwires. We were dead men walking. Command told the EOD team to stand down. They said it was too hot. They said to wait for extraction. But the EOD element leader went in anyway. She crawled through the dirt. She dismantled 3 IDs in pitch-black darkness. She took shrapnel to her shoulder. She bled through her gear. She cleared a path so 6 of my men could walk out alive." Lucas gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. He looked directly at Margaret. "She redacted her name from the citations to protect her unit," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "I never knew who she was. I just remembered her voice on the comms. And I know that coin." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "That is not a secretary. Mom, that is a captain in the United States Navy. That is the woman who saved my life. And you just sat here and called her a charity case." The silence that followed was absolute. It was total devastation. Margaret looked at me. She looked at Lucas. Her entire world, her entire fabricated reality, collapsed into dust. She had built a kingdom on a lie. And her own son had just burned it to the ground. Richard Sterling stood up. He did not look at Margaret. He walked around the long table. He stopped right beside my chair. "The billionaire, the ruthless defense contractor." He looked down at me, and he bowed his head. "Captain Vance," Richard Sterling said, his voice thick with raw respect. "I read the after-action report on that extraction. I know exactly what you did. It is the greatest honor of my life to share a table with you." He looked at the seat by the kitchen door. "Though you are sitting in the wrong damn chair." I stood up. I picked up my coin. I looked at Margaret one last time. She was weeping. She was broken. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I felt only the clean, sharp air of freedom. I turned my back on her house. I walked out the front door. And I never looked back. The front door closed with a heavy thud. It was a solid sound. A final sound. The air outside was crisp. It smelled of pine and cold asphalt. I stood on the gravel driveway. I took a deep breath. I let the freezing air fill my lungs. For the first time in 20 years, I was breathing my own air. I was not filtering it through Margaret S. expectations. I was not holding it in to make her comfortable. I was just Eleanor, Captain Eleanor Vance. A woman who had carried a crushing weight. A woman who had just set it down. The gravel crunched behind me. Fast, heavy steps. I did not need to turn around. I knew the cadence. It was the walk of a man trained to move with relentless purpose. Lucas, he stopped a few feet away. The silence between us stretched out into the night. It was not the tense, toxic silence of the dining room. It was the exhausted, hollowed-out silence of survivors. I did not know. Lucas said. His voice was ragged. It broke in the middle. I swear to God. Eleanor, if I had known it was you. If I had known what you did for us. I turned to face him. He looked completely wrecked. The polished military man in the tailored suit was gone. He was just a boy remembering the dark. Remembering the sand. Remembering the smell of copper and blinding fear. You were not supposed to know, I said. My voice was gentle. The hard edge was gone. The redaction was intentional. We do not do the work for the applause. Lucas, we do the work so you get to come home. You came home. That was the only recognition I ever needed. He shook his head. He scrubbed a heavy hand over his face. But she humiliated you. For years. She treated you like dirt. And you paid her bills. You kept this massive house afloat. Why? Why would you let her do that to you? Because trauma is a quiet, insidious thief, I said. I looked back at the sprawling, lit-up house. The shadows moving behind the expensive silk curtains. When you lose your mother young, you look for safety. You look for a roof. Margaret gave me a roof. I confused obligation with love. I confused submission with gratitude. I thought if I made myself small, she would not throw me away. It took me a very long time to realize that shrinking yourself never makes a toxic person love you more. It just gives them a smaller target to step on. Lucas stepped closer. The porch light caught the sheen of tears in his eyes. He reached out. He pulled me into a fierce, crushing embrace. It was the grip of a man holding onto a lifeline in a storm. I hugged him back. I felt the rigid tension in his broad shoulders. I felt the shared weight of a war nobody in that dining room could ever begin to comprehend. You saved my life, he whispered into my hair. You gave me back my future. I will never let anyone in this family disrespect you again. Not my mother, not anyone. You do not have to fight my battles. Lucas, I told him, stepping back and looking him in the eye. I just finished fighting this one. The war with Margaret is over. Because I am no longer stepping onto the battlefield. He nodded. He understood. Boundaries are not about controlling the other person. Boundaries are about controlling your own exposure to their venom. You cannot make a narcissist see your worth. You can only refuse to stand in their line of sight. What will you do now? He asked. The night was growing colder. The stars were brilliant and sharp above the Connecticut trees. I am going home, I said, my real home. I am going to wake up tomorrow. I am going to make coffee. I am going to live a life that does not require me to hide in the shadows. I walked toward my car. The gravel crunched under my boots. Every single step felt lighter. Every step severed and invisible. Suffocating string. I opened the car door. Lucas was still standing in the driveway. A solitary figure guarding a shattered, empty kingdom. Eleanor, he called out. He stood taller. He squared his shoulders. He raised his right hand. Slow, perfect. Razor-sharp salute. It was not a familial gesture. It was the absolute, ultimate mark of military respect. It was profound acknowledgement. It was honor. I stood by the open door of my car. I straightened my spine. I returned the salute. The movement was crisp. The meaning was absolute. I got into my car. I turned the key. I drove away from the grand estate. The winding roads were dark. The trees formed a thick canopy overhead. The headlights cut through the gloom. I drove with the windows down. The cold wind whipped through the cabin. It washed away the scent of roast beef and heavy perfume. It washed away the suffocating grip of the past. The road ahead was unwritten. It was finally mine. The engine hummed a steady rhythm. It matched the beating of my heart, a heart that was finally free. A heart that knew its own immense, unshakable value. 2 weeks passed. The fallout from the disastrous dinner was absolute. It was a quiet, sweeping devastation. Margaret's carefully curated social empire crumbled to dust. The Sterling family did not cancel the wedding. Richard Sterling was a man of his word. He respected Claire, but he drew a severe, impenetrable line with Margaret. He explicitly refused to fund her extravagant, desperate demands. The sterling wealth would never be used to prop up her fading vanity. Without my blind trust, Margaret had to face the brutal reality of her finances. She had to put the sprawling Connecticut estate on the market. The grand house with the imported crystal was gone. The fake, shimmering facade was completely shattered. She called me on a Tuesday. I let the phone ring. I let it go to voicemail. She called again on Wednesday. I answered. I did not speak. I waited for her to fill the heavy silence. Eleanor, Margaret said. Her voice was thin. It lacked all of its usual theatrical bravado. I am sorry. I truly am. I never knew. If you had just told me you were a decorated officer, if you had just told me you were the one funding the house, it was the classic, textbook apology of a manipulator. It was entirely conditional. It shifted the blame. If you had told me. An apology wrapped in an excuse is just a manipulation. Margaret, I said. My voice was calm. I was standing in my own quiet kitchen. The morning sun was pouring through the window. You are not actually sorry for how you treated me. You are sorry that you lost your audience. You are sorry that your cruelty was exposed to a billionaire whose money you desperately needed. That is not true, she cried. Her voice cracked. You are my niece. We are blood. We are family. Family forgives. Family is merely a biological fact. I countered, my tone unwavering. Respect is a basic human requirement. You demand the unconditional benefits of family while completely ignoring the responsibilities of basic decency. You measured my worth entirely by what you thought I did for a living. You decided a secretary was a convenient punching bag. You decided a military officer was a tragedy of miscommunication. But the truth is, a human being is inherently valuable regardless of their title. A clerk deserves the exact same dignity as a captain. You failed to see my humanity. You only ever saw my utility. She sobbed on the other end of the line. It was a pathetic, broken sound. I felt a fleeting moment of pity. But pity is not a foundation for a healthy relationship. I forgive you, Margaret, I said softly, but firmly. But forgiveness does not mean access. I forgive you so I can finally put this heavy baggage down. I am not carrying your deep insecurities anymore. Do not call this number again. I wish you peace. I truly do. But you will have to find it without me. I hung up the phone. I blocked the number. The action was remarkably swift. The relief was overwhelming and instantaneous. This is the hardest lesson any of us will ever have to learn. We are taught from childhood to be the peacemakers. We are taught to absorb the blows. We are conditioned by society to believe that setting a boundary is an act of aggression. It is not. Setting a boundary is an act of radical self-love. It is the purest, most necessary form of self-respect. When you tolerate disrespect, you betray your own soul. You teach the world that your dignity is negotiable. Your dignity is never negotiable. It is an inherent human right. It is born with you. It belongs solely to you. Healing is not a passive event. Healing is a fierce, active, daily choice. It requires you to look at the people who repeatedly hurt you and recognize their severe limitations. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you. You have to be willing to walk away. You have to rebuild your life on a foundation of absolute, unapologetic truth. You must actively surround yourself with people who see your value without needing a challenge coin or a massive bank statement to prove it. You demand equality, and you offer compassion. But you never sacrifice your own sanity. I poured myself a cup of black coffee. I walked out onto my wooden back porch. The world was incredibly quiet. The birds were singing softly in the large oak trees. My life was remarkably simple now. It was honest. I had spent 2 long decades diffusing complicated bombs in foreign war zones. But the most dangerous, volatile explosive I ever dismantled was the lie I told myself. The lie that I was small. The lie that I had to constantly earn my basic right to exist. I am Eleanor Vance. I am a woman who walked willingly through the fire. I saved lives in the unforgiving desert. I saved my own life at a toxic dining room table. I am whole. I am seen. I am finally. Unequivocally. Free, the sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky. Its warmth settled over my shoulders like a heavy blanket. It felt like a blessing, a quiet acknowledgement from the universe. Every person carries a hidden strength, a quiet reservoir of immense power. You do not need to shout it from the rooftops. You do not need the validation of those who willfully refuse to see you. You are the architect of your own worth. Build it strong, build it true, and never let anyone tear it down. The passage of time is the ultimate quiet healer. It does not announce its work with grand gestures or loud declarations. It simply moves forward, carrying you away from the wreckage. One ordinary sunrise at a time, I settled into a small, weather-beaten coastal town in Maine. The air here was sharp, tasting perpetually of salt and cold iron. It was a place that demanded authenticity. The ocean did not care about country club memberships or imported crystal. The crashing waves did not care about social status or the frantic, desperate climbing of women like my Aunt Margaret. The ocean simply existed, vast and undeniable. And for the first time in my life, I felt perfectly aligned with my surroundings. I bought a small cottage with gray shingles and a porch that faced the Atlantic. I spent my mornings running along the jagged cliffs, the freezing wind whipping the remaining tension out of my muscles. I was no longer an active duty captain navigating active war zones, but the discipline remained. The discipline was no longer a shield against my family's toxic projections. It was the foundation of my newfound peace. My days were entirely my own. I consulted for a private firm, writing security protocols and risk assessment models, but my true focus had shifted. I began volunteering at a local transition center for female veterans. It was at this center that I met Sarah. Sarah was 25, a former combat medic, and she was drowning in the exact same silent agony that had nearly consumed me. She had survived terrifying deployments, patching together shattered lives in the back of violently shaking helicopters. Yet, when she returned home, she was entirely paralyzed by her family's dismissive, suffocating expectations. Her mother wanted her to forget the military, to settle down, to become a soft, palatable version of a daughter. Sarah sat in my small, sunlit office at the center, her hands trembling as she described the suffocating Sunday dinners where her trauma was ignored and her achievements were belittled as a temporary, unfortunate phase. I listened to her. I watched the familiar frantic light in her eyes, the desperate need to be understood by people who were fiercely committed to misunderstanding her. I recognized the ghost of my younger self sitting in that chair. I poured her a cup of tea, set it gently on the desk, and I told her the absolute truth about family and boundaries. I told Sarah that courage is not just about walking into a combat zone. Sometimes, the most terrifying act of bravery a woman can muster is standing up from a family dinner table and walking out the front door. I explained that she was waiting for validation from people who did not have the emotional currency to afford it. You cannot buy bread at a hardware store, and you cannot get respect from people who are deeply invested in your subjugation. We talked for hours about the inherent dignity of the human spirit. I told her that equality does not begin in a courtroom or a boardroom. It begins in the living room. It begins when you look at the people who share your blood and firmly declare that your humanity is not up for debate. I taught her the EOD philosophy of emotional survival. A bomb only has the power to destroy you if you refuse to leave the blast radius. You cannot always diffuse the toxic people in your life. Most of the time, their wires are too tangled, their triggers too deeply buried in their own unhealed trauma. The only way to survive is to evacuate the area. You must establish a perimeter. You must protect your own peace with the exact same lethal focus you used to protect your squad. As Sarah listened, I saw the rigid, defensive posture of her shoulders slowly begin to drop. I saw the realization wash over her. She did not have to earn her right to exist in her own family. She just had to stop apologizing for her own strength. A full year after the catastrophic dinner in Connecticut, the remnants of my past made one final, unexpected appearance. It was early spring. The harsh Maine winter was finally breaking, yielding to a brilliant, fragile sunlight. I was walking back from the mailbox at the end of my gravel driveway when I saw the thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore a return address from a small apartment complex in Boston. I did not recognize the address, but I recognized the elegant, looping handwriting instantly. It was Claire, Margaret S. daughter, the golden bride. I stood on my porch, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean, and slowly opened the letter. I expected a defense of her mother. I expected a plea for financial reconciliation. I expected a continuation of the deeply ingrained family manipulation. What I read instead was a profound testament to the ripple effect of a single boundary. Claire did not marry the billionaire's son. She wrote that the wedding was called off just 3 weeks after our disastrous dinner, when I walked out of that house, when I shattered Margaret C's fragile, artificial empire. The shockwave had hit Claire the hardest, for her entire life. Claire had been molded into a compliant, decorative object. She was taught that a woman's ultimate value was directly tied to the wealth and status of the man she could secure. But when Lucas stood up and defended me, when I placed my unit coin on the table and refused to shrink, Claire saw a completely different version of female power. She saw a woman who possessed her own unwavering authority. In her letter, Claire confessed that she had never loved Richard Sterling's son. She was merely playing a part in Margaret's desperate, tragic play. Seeing me walk away without a single backward glance had terrified her, but it had also awakened her. It proved to her that survival outside of Margaret's control was actually possible. Claire canceled the caterers. She gave back the ring. She packed her bags, moved to Boston, and took a junior administrative job. She was struggling financially, she admitted. But for the first time in her 28 years, she was breathing free air. She was the author of her own life. She ended the letter simply. You showed me that the door was never locked. Thank you for walking through it first. I folded the letter and placed it gently on the wooden table. A profound, overwhelming sense of completion washed over me. When you break a cycle of generational abuse, you do not just save yourself. You create a blueprint for the ones who are still trapped inside the burning building. You show them where the exits are. True compassion is not about enabling destructive behavior. True compassion is about holding a standard of absolute respect, even when it costs you a relationship. By refusing to let my aunt treat me as a lesser human being, I had accidentally given her daughter the permission to demand her own humanity. We are all deeply interconnected, and the standard of dignity we demand for ourselves becomes the invisible shield for the women who are watching us. I looked out at the vast, endless horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. The water was a brilliant, sparkling sapphire. My journey had been long, marked by the smell of cordite in foreign deserts and the sting of betrayal in suburban dining rooms. But I had arrived exactly where I was meant to be. I am Eleanor Vance. I am a captain. I am a survivor. I am a woman who knows that true equality is not a gift granted by others. It is a fortress you build within your own soul. You do not need to be a soldier to be a warrior in your own life. You only need to look in the mirror, recognize the profound, inherent value of your own spirit, and violently refuse to ever let anyone write you small again. The world will adjust to your boundaries, or the world will be left behind. Either way, you will be standing in the light. Winter returned to the Maine coast. It arrived without warning. The sky turned a brutal, heavy gray. The wind howled off the Atlantic. It rattled the glass in my window frames. The ocean transformed. It went from a sparkling sapphire to a violent, bruised purple. The waves smashed against the jagged rocks. They threw freezing spray high into the air. I loved this season. I loved the harshness of it. It felt entirely honest. It stripped away all the soft illusions. It left only what was strong enough to survive the freeze. I sat by the fire in my small cottage. The heat soaked into my skin. I held a mug of black coffee. I listened to the storm. My mind was profoundly quiet. It was a quiet I had fought for. It was a peace I had earned in the dark. My work at the Veterans Center expanded. The facility was an old brick building in town. It smelled of strong tea and old wood. We had 20 women coming in weekly. They were survivors. They had survived foreign wars. They were now trying to survive their own homes. The domestic battlefield is often the most dangerous. The enemy does not wear a uniform. The enemy wears the face of a husband, a father, a mother. The injuries are not shrapnel wounds. They are invisible cuts to the soul. I led a group session every Thursday evening. The room was always full. We sat in a large circle. We did not use harsh fluorescent lights. We used soft, warm lamps. It made the room feel safe. It made the women feel seen. That winter, a new woman joined our circle. Her name was Rebecca. She was a former logistics officer. She was brilliant. She was precise. She had managed supply lines in hostile territories. She knew how to move mountains of equipment under heavy fire. But she came home to a husband who dismantled her self-worth. He did it slowly. He did it methodically. He mocked her military service. He called it a masculine phase. He controlled the bank accounts. He isolated her from her friends. He made her feel entirely dependent. He made her feel small. Rebecca sat in my group for 3 weeks without speaking. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Her shoulders were hunched. She was trying to take up absolutely no space. I recognized that posture. It was the exact posture I had held at my Aunt Margaret S. dining room table. It was the posture of a woman trying to avoid a detonation. On her 4th week, Rebecca finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. She told us about the financial control. She told us about the relentless, quiet insults. She wept. She apologized for weeping. I let the silence hold her. I did not rush to fix it. I let her feel the weight of her own truth. Then, I leaned forward. I looked directly into her tired, frightened eyes. Spoke in the calm, rhythmic cadence of a commanding officer. I told Rebecca that human rights do not stop at the front door of a marriage. Equality is not a privilege you earn by being submissive. It is a fundamental condition of your existence. No human being has the right to strip you of your autonomy. No partner has the right to dictate your worth. I told her that financial abuse is a violent act. It is designed to sever your escape routes. It is designed to keep you trapped in the blast radius. You are a logistics officer, I said. You know how to assess a threat. You know how to map an extraction point. You do not need his permission to survive. You only need your own fierce resolve. You must build a new supply line. You must secure your own perimeter. The women in the circle nodded. They understood the mission. We rallied around Rebecca. We did not offer pity. We offered absolute, unwavering solidarity. We helped her secure a quiet bank account. We helped her find a brilliant pro bono lawyer. We built an extraction plan. 2 months later, Rebecca walked out of her house. She left while her husband was at work. She did not leave a note of apology. She left a legal document. She moved into a small apartment near the center. The transformation was staggering. The hunched shoulders straightened. The whisper turned into a clear, steady voice. She reclaimed her dignity. She reclaimed her life. Watching her heal was the greatest victory I had ever witnessed. It was better than any medal. It was better than any commendation. It was the pure, undeniable triumph of the human spirit. It was the absolute proof that a woman, once awakened to her own worth, is an unstoppable force of nature. Spring finally broke the icy grip of winter. The snow melted into the dark earth. The air smelled of wet pine and salt. The ocean calmed. It returned to a deep, steady blue. I was on my porch one afternoon. I was repairing a broken wooden chair. I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. I did not expect any visitors. I stood up. I wiped my hands on a canvas rag. A dark, heavy truck shifted into park. The engine cut off. The door opened. Lucas stepped out. He was wearing civilian clothes. Faded jeans. A plain gray sweater. He looked entirely different. The rigid, high-wire tension of the active-duty operator was gone. He looked older, but he looked infinitely lighter. He walked up the wooden steps. He did not offer a formal salute this time. He offered a wide, genuine smile. I pulled him into a deep hug. We sat on the porch. We drank hot coffee from thick ceramic mugs. We watched the tide roll in. The silence between us was easy. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who no longer had anything to prove. Lucas told me about his life. He had retired from the teams. He had taken a position as a tactical instructor. He was teaching young recruits how to survive. He was passing on the knowledge. He was keeping them alive. He was happy. I could hear the deep resonance of peace in his voice. Then, the conversation naturally drifted to the past. It drifted back to Connecticut. It drifted to Margaret. Lucas looked out at the water. His jaw tightened slightly. He told me the bitter truth. Margaret's fall from grace was absolute. She lost the massive house. She lost the country club membership. She lost the wealthy friends who only loved her for her addresses and her imported wine. She was living in a small, two-bedroom condo in a standard suburb. She was entirely alone. The grand illusion was completely shattered. Luke said he visited her once a month. He went on a Sunday. He stayed for exactly 1 hour. He drank 1 cup of tea. He did not engage in her dramatic complaints. He did not fund her desperate attempts to regain her status. He had set a brutal, necessary boundary. She still asks about you, Lucas said quietly. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. She tells her new neighbors that her niece is a decorated Navy captain. She tries to use your name to buy back a little bit of respect. She does not understand the irony of it. I listened. I felt a profound stillness in my chest. I did not feel anger. I did not feel a sense of vindication. I felt only a vast, deep ocean of pity, but it was a detached pity. It was the pity you feel for a stranger. I told Lucas that compassion does not require proximity. You can wish someone well from a very safe distance. Margaret built her own cage. She forged the bars out of vanity and deep insecurity. She locked herself inside. I could not give her the key. No one could. She had to find it herself. I told him that true human connection requires vulnerability. It requires honesty. Margaret was terrified of both. You cannot save a drowning person if they refuse to admit they are in the water. You will only let them pull you down. Lucas nodded. He knew the truth of it. He had learned the lesson. He had established his own perimeter. The sun began to set. It painted the main sky in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. The colors reflected off the vast ocean. Lucas stood up to leave. He hugged me again. He thanked me for the coffee. He walked down to his truck. I watched him drive away. The red taillights faded into the evening dusk. I stood on my porch for a long time. I breathed the clean, cold air. The journey was finally complete. The girl who sat by the kitchen door was gone. The captain who fought in the desert was at peace. I was simply Eleanor. I had learned the greatest lesson of all. Dignity is a quiet, unshakable fortress. It does not require an audience. It does not require validation. It simply holds. It holds fast against the storm. It holds fast against the dark. You are exactly as valuable as you decide to be. You are the sole author of your own worth. The ink is yours. The story is yours. The light, ultimately and forever, is yours. The transition center in Maine grew. It became a sanctuary. We painted the walls a soft, warm white. We brought in heavy, solid oak furniture. We wanted the women to feel anchored. Trauma makes you feel weightless. It makes you feel untethered from the earth. We provided the gravity. We provided the safe harbor. By the second year, the local community recognized our work, but recognition always brings new challenges. A wealthy commercial developer arrived in our small coastal town. His name was Arthur Sterling. He was a distant cousin of the Sterling family from Connecticut. The connection was a bitter coincidence. Arthur wanted the brick building. He wanted to tear it down. He wanted to build luxury waterfront condominiums. He thought we were an easy target. He thought a group of broken women would simply pack up and leave. He did not understand the women he was dealing with. He did not understand me. Arthur requested a formal meeting. He walked into my office on a Tuesday morning. He wore a sharply tailored suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase. He had the arrogant stride of a man who was used to buying whatever he wanted. He sat across from my desk. He did not ask for permission. He looked at the modest furnishings. He smiled a thin, patronizing smile. He offered a check. It was a massive sum. It was meant to be an eviction notice dressed up as charity. I did not look at the check. I looked at Arthur. I saw the exact same toxic entitlement that had poisoned my Aunt Margaret. It is a disease of the soul. It is the absolute belief that wealth equates to human superiority. I pushed the check back across the desk. I kept my movements slow. I kept my breathing entirely even. I spoke to him in the flat, steady voice I used in active war zones. I told him the building was not for sale. I told him the sanctuary of these women was not a commodity. Arthur laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. He leaned forward. He tried to physically intimidate me. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to use his severe influence with the town council. He threatened to bury us in endless legal fees. He thought fear was his greatest weapon. But you cannot use fear against a woman who has dismantled live explosives in the dark. Fear is just a data point. It is just another wire to cut. I stood up. I placed my hands flat on the wooden desk. I leaned into his space. I delivered a lesson he desperately needed to hear. Arthur, I said, you measure power in dollars. You measure strength in influence. That is a fragile, hollow metric. Real power is sitting in the next room. Real power is a female combat medic who survived a war and is now surviving her own memories. You cannot buy our perimeter. You cannot intimidate a fortress. We have fought for our right to exist in peace. We have paid for this space in blood, in grief, and in sheer, unrelenting survival. I looked him dead in the eye. I stated the educational value clearly and verbally, so there could be no misunderstanding. Every human being has an absolute right to dignity. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the bedrock of a civilized society. You will not displace these women. You will not treat them as collateral damage for your profit margin. If you bring a fight to this door, you will find out exactly what kind of soldiers you are facing. Arthur Sterling lost his patronizing smile. The color drained completely from his face. He recognized the immovable object in front of him. He picked up his check. He picked up his briefcase. He walked out of my office. He walked out of our town. The town council never heard from him. The zoning threat vanished. The women in the center heard the entire exchange. They were sitting in the adjacent room. When I walked out of my office, they were standing. They were standing tall. Their shoulders were pulled back. They had witnessed a fierce boundary being enforced. They had seen human dignity defended without a single flinch. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the center fundamentally changed. It became electric. The women realized they were not just refugees hiding from the world. They were an elite unit. They were a sisterhood of absolute survivors. They learned that their peace was worth defending. They learned that they had the right to demand respect from anyone, regardless of the size of their bank account. A woman named Clara approached me later that evening. Clara was a former intelligence analyst. She had spent years decoding intercepted messages in windowless bunkers. She came to us with severe nervous tremors. Her ex-husband had gaslit her into complete submission. She had watched the confrontation with Arthur through the open door. Clara poured 2 cups of tea. She handed one to me. Her hands were not shaking. That was a small, massive victory. I have never seen anyone stand up to power like that. Clara said softly, I always thought you had to scream to be heard. You were so quiet. But you were terrifying. I took a sip of the bitter tea. Loudness is usually a sign of panic. Clara, I told her. The loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid. They use noise to cover their extreme fragility. When you know your exact worth, you do not need to shout. The truth does not need a megaphone. It only needs to be stated firmly. You have to state your own value, clearly and verbally, every single day until you believe it. Respect is your birthright. You do not ask for it. You require it. Clara nodded. She was finally decoding the most important message of her life. She was learning that she was entirely enough. 5 years passed on the rugged Maine coast. The passage of time is a ruthless editor. It cuts away the unnecessary plot lines of your life. It leaves only the absolute core. My core was this town. My core was the brick building filled with healing women. My core was the quiet, relentless pursuit of human dignity. We expanded the transition center. We bought the adjacent lot. We built a massive community garden. The women planted vegetables in the dark, rich soil. There is a specific kind of therapy in making things grow. When you have spent your life surviving destruction, creating life is a radical act of rebellion. I watched them work the soil. I watched the severe tremors stop. I watched the heavy, suffocating shadows lift completely from their faces. I was 48 years old. My hair was turning a bright, steel gray. I did not dye it. I wore it as a strict badge of honor. Every gray strand was a day I survived. Every silver line was a wire I did not cut wrong. I felt a profound, deeply anchored peace. I sat on my wooden porch on a Sunday morning. The ocean was completely calm. It looked like a sheet of hammered glass. I held my father's old shipyard compass in my hand. He was a man of very few words. He was a master machinist. He measured the world in thousandths of an inch. He taught me the single most important lesson of my life. He taught me about the unseen weld. He taught me that the vital work holding the heavy ship together is almost never visible. It holds, whether they look or not, for a very long time. I wildly misunderstood that lesson. I thought the unseen weld meant I had to be entirely invisible. I thought it meant I had to endure my Aunt Margaret's quiet cruelty without a single sound. I thought true humility meant letting other deeply flawed people erase me. I was wrong. The unseen weld is not about quietly accepting abuse. The unseen weld is your internal, unshakable integrity. It is the ironclad boundary you build inside your own soul. It is the absolute, non-negotiable standard of total respect you hold for yourself. Toxic people like Margaret will never see the weld. They are too busy looking at the superficial paint. They are too busy looking at the cheap decorations. But the massive ship does not float because of the paint. The ship floats because the structural integrity is utterly uncompromised. My structural integrity was finally perfect. I had built a life based entirely on absolute truth. I had built a life based on the profound educational value of radical compassion. The women at the center were my living legacy. Sarah, the combat medic, was now managing the facility. Rebecca, the logistics officer, was running her own highly successful consulting firm. Clara, the intelligence analyst, was teaching advanced cybersecurity to other returning veterans. They were floating. They were strong. They had built their own flawless unseen welds. We had created a fierce culture of absolute respect. We demanded fundamental human rights for ourselves, and we fiercely protected them for each other. We taught the brutal world exactly how to treat us by violently refusing to accept anything less than total equality. I received a final, thick envelope from my cousin Lucas that winter. He was heavily settled now. He had a beautiful, healthy baby girl. He sent a colored photograph. He named her Eleanor. He wrote in sharp, black ink on the back of the picture. He wrote that he desperately wanted his daughter to have the name of the bravest woman he ever knew. He wanted her to fundamentally know that female strength is never a contradiction. It is a terrifying force of nature. I held the glossy photograph. I traced the baby's face gently with my thumb. The toxic cycle of generational trauma in our family was officially broken. It ended entirely with me. It ended the exact moment I placed that heavy EOD challenge coin on the polished mahogany table. It ended the moment I violently refused to be the quiet secretary sitting by the kitchen door. The sun climbed high into the crisp Maine sky. The brilliant light spilled across the wooden planks of my porch. The air was bitterly cold, but the light was incredibly warm. I stood up. I walked slowly down to the rocky beach. The tide was pulling back. It left smooth, polished stones in its wake. The ocean is relentlessly fierce. It never stops moving. It never stops fighting the jagged shore. But there is a perfect, mathematical rhythm to it. There is a deep, abiding, undeniable order. My life finally had that exact same order. I did not need a hollow audience to validate my existence. I did not need a broken family to applaud my silent sacrifices. I was Captain Eleanor Vance. I walked directly into the terrifying dark so others could walk safely into the light. I fought for the inherent, untouchable dignity of the human spirit. I aggressively demanded respect. I freely gave heavy compassion. The long war was finally over. The perimeter was permanently secure. The unseen weld held fast. And for the rest of my days, the absolute, unshakable peace belonged solely to me. We are taught a dangerous lie from the time we are young girls. We are taught that family is an unconditional contract. We are told to keep the peace at all costs. We are conditioned to absorb the disrespect, to shrink ourselves down, to sit quietly at the edge of the table. We do this so that toxic people can feel large. We do this simply to survive. Eleanor's story completely shatters that destructive lie. Her journey is not just about extreme military bravery. It is about profound emotional survival. True strength is not always found on a foreign battlefield. Most often, it is found right in your own dining room. It is found the exact moment you refuse to be the punchline to someone else's terrible joke. You do not need to earn your basic right to exist. You do not need a high-ranking military title. You do not need a massive bank account. You do not need any of those things to demand basic human decency. When you allow toxic family members to treat you poorly, you accidentally validate their cruelty. You give them permission to keep hurting you. But when you finally stand up, when you enforce a fierce, unbreakable boundary, you stop the generational cycle of abuse dead in its tracks. Healing always begins with a single, powerful word: no. It begins when you stop funding their illusions. It begins when you walk out the front door. It begins when you violently refuse to look back. We hope this story serves as a loud reminder of your own hidden power. Your worth is inherent. Your dignity is an absolute, non-negotiable human right. Do not let anyone, especially not your own blood, tell you otherwise. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by us to bring meaning and lessons.